For the third time that week, the sound of tires ripping through wood jolted me awake before the sun even finished rising. It was 6:30 in the morning, the quiet kind of Texas morning, where you can usually hear nothing but wind through the pasture and cattle moving slowly in the distance. But that morning, the silence shattered. I walked to the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in my hand, just in time to see the same white luxury SUV blast through my ranch gate like it didn't even exist. The wood snapped apart under her bumper, and pieces of the gate flew across the gravel road like splinters. And then she kept going, straight across my property, straight through my wife's healing garden. Her tires crushed the bluebonn pots Sarah had planted during chemotherapy, flowers she'd spent weeks tending on the few days she had the strength to step outside. Gravel sprayed across the porch. My cattle scattered across the pasture in a panic. One calf bolted through the fence line, spooking the rest of the herd. The peaceful sanctuary we built to help Sarah fight cancer turned into a racetrack in the span of 5 seconds, and the driver never even slowed down. The white Lexus FU sped past our house, dust trailing behind it like a storm cloud, heading toward the luxury subdivision 2 miles down the road. The same place that had been causing us problems ever since they built it next to ranch land they clearly didn't understand. Inside the house, I heard the oxygen concentrator on the porch sputter for a moment when the dust cloud rolled through the open windows. Sarah was sitting in her chair outside, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm morning air. She had been watching monarch butterflies land on the flowers she planted along the porch rail. Now all she could see was tire tracks running straight through them. She didn't say anything right away. She just stared at the destroyed section of garden, like someone had walked through a painting and smeared the colors with their boots. "Was that her again?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer at first, because at that moment something inside me had already changed. You see, this wasn't the first time the HOA president from that subdivision decided my ranch road was her personal shortcut. It wasn't the second time either. This was the third time this week, and as I stood there, watching the dust settle over the wreckage of Sarah's flowers, one thing became crystal clear in my mind. The next time that woman tried to drive through my gate, she wasn't making it out the other side. Most people think the worst neighbor you can have is someone loud, rude, or careless. But those people are easy to deal with. You talk to them once, maybe twice, and eventually they either calm down or move away. The real problem is the kind of person who believes rules only apply to everyone else. The kind of person who thinks authority gives them ownership over things that don't belong to them. That was Brenda Winchester. She was the president of the HOA in the subdivision called Meadowbrook Heights, the fancy development about 2 miles down the road from my ranch. 200 identical houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and enough HOA rules to control the color of your mailbox. If you parked a truck in your driveway for too long, they'd send you a warning letter. If your grass grew half an inch too tall, they'd fine you. Brenda loved that power. The first time I met her was about 3 months before she started driving through my ranch like it was a public highway. I was out repairing a fence line near the entrance gate when I heard the sound of an ATV engine coming across my pasture. I looked up and saw this woman bouncing across my gravel path in high heels and a navy business suit like she was inspecting a shopping mall. She pulled up near my gate, stepped off the ATV, and started measuring the entrance with a tape measure. On my property, I walked over slowly and kept my voice calm. "Ma'am," I said, "this is private property." She didn't even look embarrassed. In fact, she barely looked at me at all. "I know," she replied, still writing numbers on a clipboard. "But this road has been used for years to reach the community water pump station behind your ranch. There's a historical access route here." There wasn't. I knew that because when Sarah and I bought this ranch, I spent weeks going through the land records. There was no easement, no public access road, nothing. Just pasture, fences, and the creek that runs through the back of the property. "I'm going to need you to use the county road," I told her. "It's about a mile longer, but it'll get you to your pump station without crossing private land." That's when she finally looked at me. And the expression on her face wasn't confusion, it was irritation, like I had just told her she couldn't sit at her favorite table in a restaurant. "I've been using this route since before you moved here," she said coldly. "The HOA has always had access. You'll need to get used to that." Then she climbed back on the ATV, revved the engine loudly, and drove straight across my pasture toward the subdivision. Leaving deep tire ruts in the gravel path Sarah had carefully maintained for years. That was the moment I realized something important. Brenda Winchester didn't think she was asking permission. She thought she already owned the road. At first, I told myself it would stop. Most problems with neighbors do. You set a boundary, they test it once or twice, and eventually everyone figures out where the line is. That's how things usually work out in the country. People respect land. They respect fences. They respect the simple idea that if it isn't yours, you don't drive across it. But Brenda Winchester wasn't interested in respect. She was interested in respect. She was interested in proving she could do whatever she wanted. After that first conversation, the ATV stopped showing up. For about a week I thought maybe she had taken the hint. Maybe someone on the HOA board told her she couldn't just ride across private ranch land like it was a park trail. Then one morning at exactly 7:15 I heard an engine again. But this time it wasn't an ATV. It was a full-size SUV. I stepped outside just in time to see that white Lexus come flying through my gate like it belonged there. Gravel sprayed across the driveway as she accelerated past the barn and cut across the open field behind the house, right through Sarah's garden. The cackle scattered immediately. A couple of younger steers bolted toward the far fence line, and one of my calves slipped in the dirt trying to keep up with the herd. The whole pasture turned into chaos in less than 10 seconds. And just like that first morning, she never slowed down. She disappeared toward the subdivision as if the ranch behind her didn't even exist. The next morning it happened again. Same time, same speed, same path across my land. By the end of that week, it had become routine. Every single morning that white Lexus tore across my property, like it was part of the subdivision's morning commute. Dust clouds rolled across the porch, gravel bounced off the barn walls, and the cattle learned to run the moment they heard the engine coming down the road. But the worst part wasn't the noise. It was what started happening on Tuesdays, because Brenda didn't just drive through the ranch anymore. She started bringing people. The first time I noticed it, 5 vehicles followed her through the gate, like some kind of suburban parade. SUVs, luxury trucks, and one minivan full of people leaning out the windows with their phones. They parked right in the middle of my pasture. I watched from the kitchen window as Brenda stepped out with a clipboard, pointing across the land like she was giving a real estate tour. People walked through the fields, across my fence lines, even into Sarah's butterfly garden. And then I heard the words that made my stomach turn. "This area," Brenda told the group proudly, "would be perfect for a community gazebo." She said it while standing on flowers my wife had planted during chemotherapy. That's when I realized something. This wasn't a shortcut anymore. Brenda Winchester wasn't just trespassing. She was planning something bigger. The moment I realized arguing with Brenda Winchester was pointless, I stopped trying to reason with her. Instead, I started watching her. Because in my experience, 28 years working around military equipment and complicated systems, the fastest way to understand a problem is to gather information. People who think they're untouchable usually make the same mistake over and over again. They assume no one is paying attention. So that weekend I drove into town and bought 6 trail cameras from the sporting goods store. The same kind, Hunty. RAS used to track deer movement. Motion activated, weatherproof, and capable of recording clear video day or night. By Sunday evening I had them hidden all across the ranch entrance. One in the cedar tree near the gate, one mounted inside a hollow fence post. 2 watching the road from opposite angles. and two more overlooking Sarah's garden, where Brenda's vehicles kept driving through. If Brenda wanted to treat my ranch like a public highway, I was going to document every second of it. The footage started rolling almost immediately. Monday morning at 7:15 sharp, the white Lexus blasted through my gate again. The cameras caught everything. The speed, the tire tracks cutting through the flower beds, the cattle scattering across the pasture. Tuesday morning was even more interesting. Instead of just Brenda, 5 vehicles followed her onto the property for another one of those so-called community tours. 12 HOA residents climbed out of their SUVs while she stood in the middle of my land, pointing at different parts of the ranch. The cameras captured every word. "This road is technically community access," Brenda explained confidently while people nodded along. "We are evaluating this property for potential neighborhood expansion options." Expansion options on my ranch. But the real surprise came 3 days later when I reviewed the footage from one of the cameras near the gate. Brenda wasn't just bringing curious neighbors onto my property, she was charging them. I watched her collect cash from 2 couples before the tour even started. $50 bills exchanged right there beside my fence line. One of the residents laughed and said something about finally getting to see a real Texas ranch experience. Brenda smiled like she was running a weekend attraction. "Authentic ranch tours," she told them. "Exclusive access." On my land, I sat at the kitchen end table that night, scrolling through the recordings on my laptop. 47 separate trespassing incidents in just 3 weeks. Every one of them time-stamped. Every one of them clearly showing vehicles crossing private property without permission. But the deeper I looked into things, the stranger the situation became. Because when I started digging into county records to find this so-called historical access road Brenda kept talking about, I discovered something that changed the entire fight. There was no easement, no access agreement, no legal document anywhere that gave that subdivision the right to cross my ranch. Which meant for months, maybe even years, Brenda Winchester hadn't just been using my land. She had been trespassing. And she had convinced an entire neighborhood that it was completely legal. The moment Brenda realized I was pushing back, she stopped pretending to be polite. Up until then, she had been acting like the situation was just a misunderstanding, like I was the confused rancher who didn't understand how things worked around her subdivision. But the day she received my certified letter demanding that she stop using my property, everything escalated. 3 days later, a thick envelope from the county planning office showed up in my mailbox. Inside was a formal notice. Meadowbrook Heights HOA had filed a legal claim for a historical right-of-way easement across my ranch. I read the document twice, then a third time. According to Brenda's filing, the subdivision had been using that route for essential community infrastructure access for more than 15 years. The letter claimed the HOA water pump station depended on the road crossing my land, and that blocking it would create a public safety issue. In other words, she was trying to turn her trespassing into a legal right. The hearing date was set for the following Thursday. And, just like that, things started getting messy. My bank called 2 days later, asking questions about a property dispute flagged by the county. Until the issue was resolved, they temporarily froze the credit line we'd been using to cover Sarah's medical bills. Then my insurance company called. Apparently, someone had reported that my ranch might be operating commercial activity without proper coverage. I didn't need to guess who had made that call. Within a week, the rumors were spreading through town. People started asking if it was true that I was running some kind of ranch tour business. One neighbor even asked if the subdivision had a legal right to build a road through my land. Brenda had turned the story upside down. In her version, she wasn't the one trespassing. I was the one blocking access to critical infrastructure. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake next to Sarah, listening to the soft hum of her oxygen concentrator, staring at the ceiling while my mind worked through the situation. I dealt with pressure before. In the Marines, we used to say, problems are just systems waiting to be understood. So the next morning, I started gathering information. First call I made was to a professional land surveyor named Pete, an old guy who had been mapping property lines in the county for nearly 40 years. He showed up with GPS equipment accurate down to a couple of inches and spent an entire day walking the boundaries of my ranch. By sunset, he had the results printed on a large map spread across the hood of his truck. He tapped one line with his finger. "Clayton," he said quietly, "your neighbor's claim doesn't just look wrong." He slid the survey map toward me. "It's impossible, because according to the official property records, that subdivision's waterline wasn't just crossing my ranch. It was illegally running through 3 other properties too. Most people think winning a fight means shouting louder or hiring the best lawyer. But after nearly 3 decades working around aircraft carriers in the Marines, I learned something different. You don't win by reacting. You win by preparing. By the time the county hearing ended, and Brenda realized her easement claim was falling apart, I already knew she wouldn't stop. People like her never admit defeat quietly. They double down. They escalate. They convince themselves that if they just push harder, everyone else will eventually give in. So instead of waiting for her next move, I built one. That weekend, I called a security contractor out of Houston who specialized in protective vehicle barriers, the kind used at government buildings and embassies. When he arrived at the ranch and looked at my gate, he understood the situation immediately. "You want something that stops a vehicle," he said, studying the driveway. "Exactly," I told him, "but it has to be legal. Clear warning signs. No surprises." He smiled slightly. "Then you want steel bollards." That said, 2 days later, his crew arrived with equipment that looked more like construction machinery than ranch tools. They cut 2 circular sections into the gravel road just inside my gate and installed heavy steel cylinders nearly 3 feet deep into the ground. 6-inch solid steel posts, hydraulically powered. When retracted, they sat flush with the surface, so a normal vehicle could pass safely. But when activated, they could rise 3 feet out of the ground in less than half a second, enough force to stop a moving truck. The system was controlled by sensors embedded in the road surface. If a vehicle approached the gate faster than 5 miles per hour without authorization, the system triggered automatically. Hydraulic pressure pushed the bollards straight up, and whatever vehicle hit them would lose that fight instantly. Before the crew left, we installed warning signs exactly where the state required them. PR evade property authorized. VAS Kiori Barras. In use everything, documented. Everything legal. When the contractor finished testing the system, I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching the steel posts rise smoothly from the ground and lock into place. They looked small, but they were immovable. That evening, Sarah and I sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the pasture. Monarch butterflies drifted across the garden she had been planting for months, landing gently on the wildflowers that Brenda's tires had crushed so many times. Sarah looked toward the gate. "You really think she'll try it again?" she asked. I took a sip of coffee and watched the empty road. People who believe rules don't apply to them always make the same mistake. They assume the next time will be just like the last time. And Brenda Winchester had been driving through my ranch every morning for months. Habits like that are hard to break, which meant sooner or later she was going to test that gate again. The final morning started quieter than usual. No engines, no dust clouds, no white Lexus tearing across the pasture. For a moment, sitting on the porch with my coffee, I wondered if Brenda had finally realized the fight was over. Maybe the legal pressure, the cameras, and the warning signs had convinced her to find another route to that water station. But people like Brenda don't quit. They escalate. Around 10:30 a.m., I heard the sound of engines coming from the direction of the subdivision. Not one engine, A lot of them. I stood up slowly and looked toward the road. A convoy of vehicles was heading toward my ranch. SUVs, pickup trucks, and minivans, at least a dozen of them, rolling down the dirt road like they were part of some suburban parade. And right at the front of the line was the same white Lexus I had been watching for months. Brenda had organized a show of force. Later, I learned she had told the entire HOA that morning that I was illegally blocking their community's water supply. She framed it like a heroic mission. Neighbors standing together to reclaim their rights. From the porch, I watched the convoy approach the gate. They slowed for a moment while Brenda leaned out of her window, probably explaining the plan to the drivers behind her. I could see phones already pointed forward, recording the moment for social media. She wanted an audience. What she didn't realize was that she had one. 2 unmarked federal vehicles were parked down the road, exactly where the investigators said they would be. I had called them an hour earlier. The Lexus rolled forward. Instead of slowing down to read the warning signs, Brenda hit the accelerator like she always did. Months of habit had convinced her that nothing on my ranch could actually stop her. Her SUV crossed a sensor plate at about 15 miles per hour. That's when the steel bollards activated. There was a sharp metallic clang as 2 thick cylinders shot up from the ground directly in front of her vehicle. The impact was immediate. The Lexus slammed down onto the steel posts with a violent crunch of metal and shattered plastic. Steam burst from the engine compartment as the undercarriage tore open against the bollards. The convoy behind her froze. Engines idled. Drivers stared in disbelief as Brenda's luxury SUV sat stuck on the steel posts, like it had been dropped onto a pair of spears. Then the federal agents stepped out of their cars. They walked straight toward the disabled Lexus, while Brenda climbed out of the driver's seat screaming about property rights and community access. One of the agents calmly showed her a warrant, years of forged documents, financial fraud, criminal trespassing. All of it had been building toward that moment. And as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Brenda Winchester finally learned something she should have understood from the beginning. Some gates aren't meant to be driven through.